So it seems that whenever you come across a thief, brigand, rogue, or other sneaky ruffian portrayed in medieval fantasy, they can't help but clad themselves in a hodgepodge of leather scraps of questionable utility. For those with a bit of practical knowledge on historical armors, it is understood that the classic leather-clad rogue is nothing more than a silly trope used to give the sneaky classes in a role-playing game a unique armor type distinct from the mage's cloth and the warrior's metal plate. While it is accurate to say that most fantasy depictions of leather armor are functionally absurd, it's worth acknowledging that leather armor has some historical basis, can provide protective benefits, and shouldn't be excluded from fantasy outright. With that in mind, I intend to look into the practicality of this style of armor, and we'll see if we can create a few designs of leather protection that have a good basis in material reality. Instead of completely disregarding that which isn't practical, let's see if we can reform it into something that makes logical sense, while allowing the tropes we all know and love to live on. As you may know, if you take a common piece of floppy, thin leather like the type you'd find on a modern jacket, it won't put up any meaningful resistance to weaponry used in medieval warfare. Leather sheets on their own won't dissipate blunt force, they aren't hard enough to stop decent cuts, and they have no ability to stop a thrust from a sharp point whatsoever. That being said, with a few adjustments, leather can be turned into something with a significant protective potential. I'd like to briefly address that in a fantasy setting, all kinds of fictional animals and creatures could have hides that might provide much better protection than what's possible in reality. But for the purposes of this video, I want to look at common leather specifically, so no furs or dragon skins. There are a variety of processes, including soaking in wax or resin, heating in water, and combining layers and padding that can turn flimsy leather into proper protective plates. I don't have the resources to do any meaningful experiments on these forms of leather myself, but channels like Todd's Workshop and Skyrim have done tests which show leather being capable of withstanding cuts from common slashes, even up to a strike from a heavy cleaver. This sort of experimental archaeology is very important to understanding the practicality of speculative armors. I've tried to base my designs in realism as much as possible, but there will always be a debate as to how these materials were made and how they function, and I would encourage you to check out other videos to make your own conclusions as to the viability of leather as a form of protection. From what I've been able to find, it seems that leather plates can withstand most cuts and slashes, dissipate a decent amount of blunt force, and even lessen the penetration of a thrust even if it isn't halted altogether. Luckily, we have more than mere material speculation at our disposal when it comes to judging the realism of leather armor. Although rare, historical examples do exist, and this will provide the best inspiration for a practical fantasy design. When looking into historical examples, we have to remember that archaeological finds will be limited by the fact that leather biodegrades relatively quickly. That, combined with the fact that leather armor is often a cheaper option, makes it less desirable to preserve in a collection to be passed through the generations. All of this to say that leather armor may have been more prevalent than we realize. The examples we do have from artifacts and written accounts include pieces such as cuillaboulis, French for boiled leather, a type of leather plate that can be made into a variety of shapes that mimic the same basic patterns as metal plate armor. Some of you may already be familiar with the lamellar and scale armors. These were common in antiquity and later in the Middle and Far East. It's made by lacing a series of smaller leather plates together, which causes some overlap and is presumably cheaper to produce because it can be made of scrap and offcuts. When looking into more flexible forms of leather, we have things like the buff coat, a thick leather jacket with sections of overlapping layers that was used in the 17th century after full suits of steel plate were no longer commonplace on the battlefield. I'm sure plenty of other configurations for leather armor existed throughout the ages, but suffice it to say leather armor is more than a mere fantasy trope. For those of you who are unaware of the existence of real leather armor, I think Hollywood and other pop culture may have muddied the waters when it comes to discussions of this topic, and therefore resulted in the belief that leather armor is pure fantasy. The concept of studded leather is one of the worst offenders when it comes to fantasy absurdities. Dungeons & Dragons even has it as a specific category with its own stats and class affiliations. Obviously, putting a few metal studs on an otherwise ineffective sheet of leather isn't going to turn it into a functional piece of armor. Brigandine, however, a style of metal plate armor consisting of a leather facing, connecting dozens of riveted metal plates underneath, is very real, and the distinctive look that it has likely created many misconceptions about its construction, leading to some bad interpretations in media. Common fantasy depictions show roguish characters in thin, form-hugging leather, usually affixed with a variety of pointless straps and buckles connecting crudely stitched, floppy, studded patches. Not only would something constructed like this not provide functional protection, but leather can be kinda squeaky, and buckles tend to rattle. If we want to think of leather armor in the context of a stealthy individual, we need to recontextualize the way we understand the material. Let's take a moment to understand some of the actual benefits of leather-crafted armor, and see how we can justify its existence beyond just thinking it has a cool look for rough fantasy characters. Leather is typically cheaper than steel, and when you take into consideration the highly skilled profession of armor smithing, plate harness isn't exactly cheap. If you're a less affluent individual, it can be significantly more affordable to craft your own armor out of leather than it would be to buy some from a professional steelsmith. Even I, with no professional training, have made a few basic items out of leather. It can be shaped, stitched, and even decorated with embossing with relatively cheap materials and limited facilities. I bought a leatherworking set for about $30 a few years ago. Not the same price as it would be in a medieval-inspired economy, but the point still stands. Also, leather doesn't rust. It can get a degree of structural damage from extreme temperature and other environmental factors, but for the most part, maintenance should be easier to keep up with than steel. An adventurer or mercenary may choose leather armor for this reason alone. If you can't maintain your armor without servants in the long term, how practical is your armor really going to be if you're alone on the trail? While leather plates would be a bit quieter than clanking steel, if you really wanted a sneaky stealth armor, you would probably opt for a garment similar to the buff coat. This type of garment is best against lighter cuts and slices. It's not going to stop most arrows or a strike from a lance, but then again, if you're mostly sneaking through buildings and getting into fights in back alleys, you wouldn't need it to withstand the hazards of a battlefield. Given that leather armor is generally best suited against cutting damage, it stands reason to assume that it would be used more in cultures that favored more cut-focused blade designs. Other contexts in which you just want to avoid glancing blows and cuts in a rapier duel, for example, could also be appropriate. So, taking all this into account, I can start my process for designing some practical styles of leather armor. I'd like to showcase a couple of different configurations to show that this concept doesn't need to be one note or restrictive. I want one figure to embody the classic roguish archetype, knife-wielding, dashing, light on his feet, that sort of thing, and another to show off a more mercenary style that takes some notes from less Eurocentric motifs. I really like the style of the buff coat, but the historical examples have tailoring that is very endemic of 1600s fashion. But garments of this make could easily be cut to fit almost any pattern, and therefore could resemble a medieval doublet, a full-body robe, or really anything you like. For my illustration, I decided to go with something that is stylistically halfway between medieval and Renaissance. The layering of the collar, shoulders, and sleeves would provide increased protection, and the bagginess of the garment would allow blows to get more caught up and hit with less force. The boots, gauntlets, and helm would be made of hardened leather plates that were then covered in a more attractive, flexible layer of leather for aesthetic reasons and decoration. These pieces would have the same general feeling of rigidity as a thick piece of plastic without the weakness or brittle cracking. This overall configuration would be good for a duelist or agent who needs to spend most of his time in a civilian context and not draw too much attention to himself. Most of what he's wearing mimics hats and clothing from a distance. Moving on to our mercenary, I want there to be components of lamellar in the areas that require less protection or need that level of mobility. The rigid, vital areas, like the top of the head and chest, would be made out of the thickest, most solid leather plates. The breast and shoulder piece would be one solid construction, similar to the linothorax used by the Greek hoplites. The slight bendability of the leather would allow for this garment to be put on as one piece and laced together on the side, with the shoulders tied down in the front. A leather buckler could be made in the same way as the other plates, only it would need some kind of circular wooden frame to be used as a base. The shield, as well as the rest of the armor, could be embossed with decorative patterns and other motifs to add as much fancy adornment as the material will allow. Although I've chosen to show both figures in leather armor exclusively, I would imagine that in reality many of these individual pieces would be used to supplement other armor types when appropriate. For example, a steel breastplate could be worn over the buff coat, sort of wedged under the collar, or the leather arm cannon of the mercenary may be used over a mail hauberk, etc. When all's said and done, I wanted to show off functional leather armor in a realistic way that doesn't betray the tropes affiliated with the style outright. Many different styles and configurations could exist. I just wanted to showcase something practical to help us all contemplate the possibilities of the material without the need to fall into the tired old inaccuracies that have caused a repetitive stagnation in our collective ideas of fantasy designs. So there we have it, a couple of practical configurations of fantasy leather armor. I hope you've enjoyed the process, and I would love to hear your further thoughts on the subject in the comments below. I would like to look into creating illustrations for other material types in the future, such as bones, creature hides, wood, etc. If you're interested in that sort of thing, or in fantasy and pop culture redesigns in general, stay tuned for more videos to come. Thank you for watching.